Leila, to what extent was the Queen involved in museum policy making?
Well, I mean, it couldn't have existed without her, obviously. The initial ideas for the museum, she had advisors, but I think the whole idea, the whole planning, everything had to come from her. She had, obviously, input from various European groups also. I think it would kind of finally, in the final result, it would be a combination of, in terms of the entire museum policy, which means how the museums were going to be run, the whole aspect of them, which I already talked about. The notion of a modern Western museum had to come from the West. And I think it was a combination of, say, experts from ICOM and the Metropolitan particularly, various individuals' inputs such as Bahadouri, and I think also a lot of influence from Reza Ghotbi, because he had already set up a similar mechanism. If you think of television, you know, it was the most advanced and the most supportive organization in Iran, the most modern thinking. It found a place for homeless intellectuals, which probably also would have happened with us eventually if it had continued, for better or worse. So I think a lot of the input, certainly in terms of making up the foundation, the rules of the foundation, that was Reza Ghotbi's baby, and how the museums fit into that. And I think the policy just developed, you know, a combination of all these different things, and finally coming together with the idea of the Bonyad. Finally, Her Majesty's Foundation. The idea that we would finally have board of directors and budgets, and that I think went hand in hand with the development of the Bonyad and the idea of setting up an entity, a non-profit entity, which is what a museum was. It was a pretty radical notion for Iran. We had governments and we had private businesses, with non-profit institutions that were going to be run by individuals and not by members of the royal family, which we were only by proxy or by marriage, as it turns out. Really was going to be new. I mean, there were social organizations, but they were headed by Mrs. Diba or by Princess Ashraf or something. Anyway, so I would say she was directly involved in the entire setup.
And how often did you consult her, and on what subjects, basically?
Very little. I think, my original vetting happened when I first came to Iran, and I had my serious conversation with her. Once she had made up her mind that you were going to do the job, that was it. I would consult with her if she came to the museum. She had a habit of dropping by before, which was very reassuring in a way, because you knew someone was there, especially before the 2 times I think she came before we were opening an exhibition. And, just to make sure, and if you needed something, I mean, she was always there. If you did need something very simple, like, there are no lights outside, or the trash cans need painting, or, something as ludicrous as that, she would be thinking of. She would have to, I guess she'd learned that she had to worry about these kind of details. And so, she would have that kind of a personal involvement.
She was helpful on all levels, she found, always.
Yeah. I remember particularly when we were opening the museum, I'd been so busy installing it all. I hadn't had time to sort of make up a little speech or, sort of a guided tour yet. And I mean, it was absolutely manic working under those conditions to get it open for a specific time. And the museum was going to be opened in the presence of King Juan Carlos and Queen Sophie. And so what happened was that, with obviously the Shah and the Queen and then everyone else, and this was rather intimidating for me, as you can imagine. So what happened was that Mr. Bahadouri took around the King and King Juan Carlos, and I was to take around Her Majesty and Queen Sophie. Well, I was so bloody nervous. I couldn't speak. Barely. I just totally lost my tongue. Well, Her Majesty did the tour for me.
Really?
She really did. I mean, I just managed to get out the very basics, and she knew everything about the whole collection. I mean, because so much of it had come via her. The enamels, the blue. I remember specifically she talked about all the Bohemian crystal, and I'm going there. Oh yes, Your Majesty, that's right. And she was so gracious about it. Years later, when Johann Sadat came, and there I took her around, Her Majesty said to me at the end, she says, Leila, you were really wonderful. Congratulations, you know. And I thought, well, the only other time you heard me, you know, I was so nervous and so exhausted. You had to do the job for me. I mean, these sort of things happen. I think she viewed the museums as her babies, almost. You know, she took a personal interest in them, a great personal interest, but she gave you total freedom in running them. I was never interfered with once.
Because she trusted you.
Yeah. You know, I mean, I think that was why she had certain people running these. And in a way, you know, they were, on an international level, on a national level, they were very small projects. I mean, they really were. But they were visible. They were highly visible politically. First of all, because personalities came and went, you know, and they were associated with the royals. So in that sense, it was a high-profile kind of job, and she wanted it to be run perhaps by low-profile people in a way. So, as I said, I always found her very helpful if I ever went to her with a problem, very interested. I would bring, say, the catalogs, or, you know, if there was a work of art we were hoping of getting, or something like that, you know, on a level of help. I think this has always been something you could always go to her and say, can we do this? Could you be helpful there? Or she herself would come and say, here's something for you. She was very aware of art in general and what was going on. And, you know, I remember one time particularly we were on a plane together, and she called me over and she said, you know, there's an interesting collection of the sketches of a 19th century Iranian artist of the Daftar Mkhصوص. Why don't you go and look at this? Well, I'd never heard of these, and I would never have heard of them if she had mentioned it. And sure enough, I eventually trotted over to the Daftar Mkhصوص, and I had access to these piles and piles of absolutely priceless, original sketches and pounces of this whole artistic family. And it was a unique circumstance.
No one would have ever informed you of this?
I don't think so. It
was your domain.
It was, yes. But I wouldn't have known about it unless she'd mentioned it. I mean, they were perfectly happy to show it to me once I sent it to them. You know, what Her Majesty told me these things were there. Yes, then I was shocked. But by that time I was at the Nagaaristan, and what was mine, and what was theirs was theirs. But I mean, this is just to show you sort of, she often was a person to whom all information came. And this is the thing, is that, you know, you have to realize the information was there. It would come out whenever she felt it was appropriate. She never interfered. I can never say, that just was not her style. She gave you the general parameters. I think she let you sort of try and feel your way, you know. You know, that's what I was with her a lot, but I didn't talk much about the museum because it was not something I considered of, you know, major importance. Maybe someone else would have taken every day, every occasion to spend, you know, you see, to use it as a sort of tremplin to talk. But I found there was no need to involve her. And the fact that she came to the museum a few times a year, that she knew what the exhibitions were, that she knew what the art was that we were collecting, if there were any problems. I would go to her sometimes, but I wouldn't go to her much, because I was very conscious of the fact that one shouldn't abuse the access, because it made you very unpopular with people you had to work with. Therefore, problems I very rarely went to her with, because she herself knew that if I went to her with a problem over Bahaduri's or Nahabandi's head, the only person who was going to lose was going to be me. So I was very careful not to do this. I never did it. I don't think I ever did it.
You were smart not to do it.
Well, it was just, you know, it was just logical. That's what they were the most afraid of. If you had access, the people you had to work with were the most afraid that you would abuse it. So you had to be careful. There was no point in doing it. Now, in terms of other aspects of her involvement.
In other words, you're saying that she was well informed and that she was a wonderful patron of the arts. But what about her directives? Were they effective?
I think they went through a lot of anger, a lot of anguish before things got done. I think she herself was conscious of this. that there was bureaucracy along the way. I mean, this image of our royals as being supremely powerful is nonsense. Yes, they could give the orders, but it could take sometimes years for things to happen, or dreams that she had. You know, it was like the myth of Sisyphus, you know, constantly taking the walk to the top and having come to the bottom. So I think there were times, yes. But seeing how long it took to put the museums together, seeing what incredible contradictions and personalities and difficulties were involved, you have to think that often, no, or that because there were many special interest groups, often things just got mislaid. And she had to fight, perhaps, very much for anything she wanted, you know?
Do you know of any particular incidents?
I can just think of the way the museums developed, you know, and even in terms of the Nagaarstan, the 3 or 4 people involved, and each one wanting his own input, and the conflicts, and I mean something like the cultural center. Well, this was a big source of controversy from day one. Why? Because it was Iranpur's baby, and then Professor Fritsch was jealous because it was his project and he should have been given it. You know, so the thing, I mean, this kind of thing. You know, what her ideals were, you know, and what all the difficulties were, even in the change in the cabinet, you know, the switch from Bahaduri to Nahavandi. All of this affected her plans and her projects. So, I mean, someone like Bahaduri was a very good, what's the word? He tried to follow her directives as much as possible, but he was not an initiator, and he wasn't a political power in Iran.
No, and he didn't try to?
Oh, no, I think he did, because it was very much in his interest to, and because he had a tremendous amount of push, and because he already had a lot of power bases. It was when Nahavandi came that the museums finally got off the ground. You know, all those years when Bahaduri was there, I mean, you can't attribute it only to the quality of the chef de cabinet. But part of it, I mean, there was more money, there were perhaps other circumstances, everything finally came together. And Nahavandi was a strong force, and it was because he wanted to have a very highly visible profile, I think, that he pushed these programs through, because it was, you know, it wasn't just what the Queen wanted, there were many, many other things involved. You know, so that's when the Carpet Museum opened, and he wanted the Carpet Museum, and the new Cultural Center, and the Tomoka, and, you know, he was a very strong personality. So maybe if you contrast the two, you would get an answer.
Overall, were you ever aware of any acts of corruption?
No, I didn't see anything. But you know that I personally had very little access to funds. And therefore, being that my visually seeing anything, yeah, I had somebody in my office steal something, you know. But personally, ever to have seen anything, no. Yeah, well, sort of as we look back, I think that it's very ironic that in the years I was in Iran were the years in which tremendous events happened. It was as if time and events were really telescoped into a very, very short period. And we saw the beginnings of Her Majesty's museums, from stumbling, you know, along the Nagaarstan to a totally full-fledged, non-profit organization called Her Majesty's Foundation, which finally came into being. And this foundation was not just a paper foundation. I really want to emphasize that. From the Board of Trustees down to the Board of Directors to all the various things, it was a very strong entity. And I think the irony of it is that perhaps it would even have been a political entity, exactly what people had always been afraid of with her. Even though we think of the art scene as very small, as I said again, it was a highly visible scene. You could get a lot of press out of it, you could get a lot of propaganda out of it, so potentially there was a system set up by which the Queen's power base would have increased. And I think it's very sort of sad that it happened at a moment in time when already everything was falling apart, and so that we were out of sync with the rest of society. Just as, you know, it was November 78 and I created my magnum opus about the Turkomans, But, you kept on working because you had to. I mean, you kept on working partly because you were like lemmings, and you just kept on towards that cliff without pausing to think, and there were no signs to tell you not to go there anymore. So I think it's really very interesting in terms of the arts patronage, what was happening. I have to say that there had been increasing criticism. In '78, we didn't have the Shiraz Festival because of what had happened the year before. So
what had happened the year
there
before?
had been a big scandal in Shiraz about the bread and puppet theater. They had the whole city was used as a stage for various events. They used caravanserais, they used gardens, and at one point the bread and puppet theater, which was a very radical European theater troupe, did a sort of improvisational play behind a storefront, and it included the killing of a baby. Well, this somehow spilled out into the street and caused a riot. I mean, was a terrible incident, because there was a terrible, clash you can understand between, even Westerners have terrible trouble, understanding or accepting the bread and puppet theater, not to speak of a local Shirazi seeing something like this. He would have gone nuts. Anyway, so that had happened the year before. And so even though I say, the Bنیاد and all that, 77 was the height, I think, in terms of her achievements in the arts, where she must have felt that finally everything was coming together. The museums were opened, everything was in place. And in 78, was the year when everything started falling apart for everyone.
How, in what ways did you feel it? Or did you feel that the Queen felt it?
Well, you had to feel it in the summer of '78. I had some strange experiences because of the museum. The museum was very far downtown, and I was a manager-director, really. I was a mdیر عامل, which meant I often had a lot of contact with the employees. And if you remember, one of the centers of anti-government activity was in Tabriz, but almost a year before the revolution happened. And I had a lady who worked for me for public relations, who was, I think she was vaguely related to some generals, but she worked for me as a public relations.
What was her name?
Mrs. Zandi, I remember. She came into my office one day, practically in hysterics, and told me about what was happening in Tabriz, that there were terrible riots, the police had intervened, and here was the shocker. A girl had been raped and thrown herself out of, I don't know how many story building into the streets below. And that this was not one or two or three incidents. So I had already come across something that to me was very shocking. And even though I never found out if it was the whole truth, she believed it. And she started telling me, there isn't anybody I don't know who didn't lose somebody in Tabriz. And I remember when she started telling me this, it was very frightening to know that there were a whole group of people that came out of a military background who came to me in hysterics, this woman, whether what she was saying was the truth or whether it was, what's the word, whatever, just rumors. The point was that she believed it. And she was an official working for me in a sensitive court ministry position. So this was something that I recall as something that affected me a lot.
Made you aware.
Yeah. And then in the summer, of course, in summer of '78 was the time in which a lot of things were developing, many riots everywhere. And we were at No Shah, and the atmosphere was pretty tense, very quiet. And I remember the Shah was being urged to go on television to make some kind of statement and appeal to the people. And I remember
This is what the people were talking about in No Shah when you were there.
No, I don't think they were talking about it, but we knew what was happening, and we knew that Reza Hotbi was coming to interview him, and everything was done from No Shah in the summers.
And Reza Hotbi was still accepted and held tight to his position.
Yes, this is in August '78. Remember, the Shah gave a talk on television about how if you don't watch out, Iran will become an Iranistan. And nobody understood what he was talking about. But now, I don't know if that was in August. I mean, this is the one thing I remember of all the things he said, and I now understand what he meant by Afghanistan, but at that point I thought it was very cryptic.
What did he mean by that?
I think he meant a satellite, a province, and not a country anymore, like Afghanistan, Pakistan. I mean, something that's a land of someone else, not a land of your own anymore. So, in any case, that was very obvious there. And then, of course, court life ceased. Parties, yeah, except in an absolutely minor way, very, very minor way. So that obviously was a pretty good indication. And eventually, even though it had always been a rule that at court you didn't talk politics, even though it wasn't politics anymore, you couldn't avoid it, you know. We didn't see the king at all after the fall, at all. After maybe September, maximum October. He just wasn't seeing anybody. And the Queen was aware, but certainly for us, even though at one point, you know, we said to her, what can we do? Can we do anything? She said, yes, go out and, you know, do something. But there was nothing more than that.
But she said, go out and do, she was at a loss, you mean, confused as to what one could do.
I suppose so, yeah. She you know, we were trying to think of, you know, what we could do. But
what were your ideas on what you could possibly do? Was there anything
I was totally very naive. It was at a point in which there were a lot of marches and parades and things going on in Iraq. If you remember, they were, you know, sort of rioting in the city and so on. And my museum was in the center of it. You know, it was a very bad place. And every day you were, you know, hearing bullets and so on. It was between Tehran University and the Majlis, you know. So I was very concerned for the safety of my employees and for the safety of the museum, of the objects. And I had removed everything into a bunker kind of situation, and dismissing, you know, the employees and, you know, making sure at least when they traveled back and forth they were safe and so on. So, you know, you knew that it was the time of the military law. I mean, things were not going well. But even within this, you know, you kept on working. You kept on planning your shows and buying your art and doing everything. But contact with Her Majesty was very limited. You knew she was very aware. She didn't take me into her confidence. I wasn't a political advisor. There was no reason to. You knew that she was worried and that she was trying to do things. But what, I can't say on a more specific level. That we all would have wanted to do something was obvious, but that there was no guidance, that there were no rules to go by. I remember thinking, well, I'm a Mudיר, I have 60, 80 people who work for me. Why couldn't I get them to make some placards and go out in the street and protest? I mean, they'd go for me. I knew they would have gone. They came to me and asked me. You know, they were not and the people who worked for me didn't want to see the revolution happen, obviously. You know, that was, you know, each person within his own possibilities would have thought of, could I or couldn't I do something? But there were 2 or 3 things that I think finally, one was this incident I told you about with this lady. Another one was when you were no longer going out anywhere at night, and you'd sit home and watch the television to find out what was happening to your own country, or you'd listen to the BBC to find out what was happening. And one night we were watching it, and there was a so-called massacre at Tehran University that was filmed and put on television, which was the single most shocking thing I saw. I don't know if you saw it, but this was in October, I think, somewhere in October, I think. This was terrifying. I've never seen anything like it. I've never seen, you know, because you heard about the riots, but you weren't there.
Actually aware of it.
You know, and it was a terrible controversy afterwards as to why it had been put on the TV. And I know many people were terribly affected by it, because this really showed you that there was terrible opposition, and that it was violent, and that people were getting killed, and they were maybe people you knew. So that was something you couldn't You really couldn't avoid that.
Mm-hmm.
And another thing that happened was just after the incident of the Maidan Jaleh, a sculptor called Pavis Kanavoli came to my office, and he told me about it.
He was there?
No, he wasn't there, no. But he described it very vividly. And his emotionalism and his reaction affected me a great deal.
What was his reaction?
Well, I mean, you know, he was horrified, and, you know, I mean, everybody was horrified at the idea of civil war, at the idea of people being killed, at the idea of marches and demonstrations. But I mean, Maidan Jaleh was, you know, I mean, it was grossly exaggerated out of all proportion. But, you know, I remember figures like 3,000 finally came down to maybe 50 people who had been accidentally fired on. But I mean, it was, you know, I mean, who made sense in those days? I mean, you could say, well, nobody was equipped to handle demonstrations in Iran. I mean, neither our gendarmerie nor our army nor the Sarak, none of these people knew how to deal with demonstrations, to contain them and not to injure too many people. This is a science we didn't have, you know. So, but I mean, his description of it was what, you know, when I think of the things that really, really, you know, stand out for me, these 3 or 4 incidents were what did it for me. And
looking back, Leila, if you were to do it all over again, not just you, but on a larger scale, what would you do? How would you what would you change? What do you regret?
I have to keep saying the word ironic and irony, because you're caught in a historical moment. You're caught in a catch-22 situation where you are totally dependent on the West. No matter how much you do, you're a product of your own culture, which is medieval, or you're a product of a Western culture, which does not have any roots that can take hold of in your country. The fact that I'm aware of this, that I became aware of it by working in the Nagorno, and afterwards by reading a book that very much influenced me. It's a book called Orientalism by a man called Edward Said. He's a Palestinian activist who teaches at Columbia University. And he dealt with the subject of how the West had perceived the Near East since the 19th century. And in it he showed that we were basically the tools of the West. No matter how much we thought that we would think independently or act independently, the fact that you were educated abroad inevitably made you a kind of marionette. And he showed this in you know, a 300-page book that had to do with literature and the image of the Near East in particularly French literature and so on. It applied to my field just as much. And if I think that there's one thing I'm going to do now, is to make people aware of this Orientalism in the arts, if you like, which is an attitude that is prevalent in the West of snobbery and of cultural snobbery, in which, you know, the products of the Near East are considered as inferior to anything that's produced in the West. That this was consciously or unconsciously present in practically everything we did is the irony. I don't think Iran was unusual in that we were caught in this. I don't think anyone even understood this. Or many of us, certainly not the younger people. Maybe somebody like, you know, the old Iranian erudites, you know, or maybe even a man like Jamalzadeh or a constitutionalist fighter in 1906 would have understood more about this than we did, you know? Modernism at any price is simply not what was going to succeed. If I were to go back now, I would say, how can we change that? How can you change that? You see, I mean, Khomeini's solution is just shut the doors to the West, just the way China shut the doors to the West. Don't let anything filter through. But you can't live in a vacuum either. You can't live in a vase clos from the rest of the world, which he's finding out now. I mean, you cannot go back and just teach what Muhammad said in the 7th century. You can't. It's impossible. Then again, what is this irony of fate that even in terms of the art scenes, the Iranians weren't competent enough. The Iranian-trained Iranians weren't competent enough. And the Western-trained Iranians weren't competent enough. Each one lacking what the other had. There had to be someone who would have both. Very little of it. I mean, I have to be realistic about myself. I spoke a modicum of Farsi. I had a certain level of Farsi understanding. But God knows if I had been a woman who had been able to re-enlarge our history in the original manuscript Farsi, I would have been a lot better off. But I couldn't. That wasn't my fault. But the men who could were not people who could run the museums. So, again and again, you'd see it over again. Or even I myself brought values to my job that were anathema, I think, to many Iranians. That I can say that the biggest turnout I had was for an exhibition of religious painting. Is very weird. I mean, what is strange about the whole situation is that in theory, the idea of an exhibition of religious painting is Western. See, this is where the hope is, though. It was a Western idea in a royal museum, and yet the people came to see it. The people just poured in. Why? Because I was speaking their language. Now, I'm sure, without realizing it, but I was speaking their language because I had, as I told you, this Dr. Hazavi, who
spoke their language.
Who spoke their language. But he was willing to come and work with me. He didn't have any problem with me. I was very lucky. Maybe, if there had been such a possibility of having young people, idealistic young people, if you like, with big ideas, but getting them to work with someone of the people who understood the people more. I mean, that's on my own scale. I can't talk about what went wrong with the plan organization or what went wrong with the way we pumped oil out or why we had, nuclear plants or so many other things. But how would you do it over? I don't know, because I think I'm one of the persons that is extremely conscious of this cultural problem. I don't know how you do it. And I don't know of any country. I think if I were to look at a country that I would say we might learn something from, I would say India. With all its problems. India is a country, I went there recently, and in a way I was comparing it to Iran. It hasn't, unbelievable problems compared to Iran. But very early on, they learned from Gandhi that if you brought modern technology to a local Indian village that made its living off the women sitting there hand-looming materials that would be sold in the bazaars, you were going to destroy the village. Now, Gandhi knew this. The Indians, clopin, have more or less applied this. When you go to India, you drink Indian soft drinks. They taste horrible, but they're made and bottled in India. You only have Indian food, Indian clothes, whatever. The economy is rudimentary, it's old-fashioned, but they have a nuclear plant and device too. But what I'm trying to say is that maybe the Indians, they had independence, and they also had, they had a lot of British infrastructure, which we didn't. The British, when they pulled out of India, they left it with a tremendous government and educational system, which still is very, very strong foundation. So maybe that is a place.
They allowed their roots to flourish.
Yeah, and we're conscious that modernism was not always the answer.